I had a couple of questions. Only one I'm going to answer first. People ask why we use the translation "man befriending God," where it's often translated as "man loving God" or "lover of mankind," which is fine. But I noticed a number of Greeks and Russians as well had told me that there's more of a meaning. It doesn't mean just that. There's something else that's expressed in that. And that's true because the degrees of love that are expressed in Greek and in Slavonic are not generally expressed in English because our language has become, the language is fine, but the use of the language in English has become poverty-stricken. And people are afraid to learn how to use the English language, so they kind of mutter the English language. And a lot of people from overseas who have learned English, particularly those who've learned English in England, use much more of the language than we do. And people are also afraid of poetry and beauty in language. They don't like it. It's very difficult to do it as a tweet or something, or as whatever those little things are, messages they send.
Facebook.
Yeah, there's little abbreviated messages. But the fact is, philanthropos is one who befriends mankind, not just one who loves mankind, but befriending. That is, of course, friendship doesn't mean anything in English anymore. You meet somebody for 5 minutes, you say they're a friend. We probably have 4 or 5 friends in our entire life. Everybody else is an acquaintance, but they're not a friend. A friend is somebody who embraces you and there's a very deep trust between you. And a friend is somebody who accepts you however you are, even with your weaknesses and shortcomings. A friend is always someone who will forgive you and who's always willing to accept your forgiveness, and always, it's a bond of relationship that has strength and sustenance to it. And so man befriending is really because the implication is someone who embraces us with a kind of love that is willing to share with us, to share everything with us. So anyway, that's why we use it, and it's been translated that way from the Greek by a number of people, and we accepted that translation. But anyway, it doesn't, not a particular issue, someone simply asked it. The other thing I was asked was to say something about wakefulness, because we have this concept of spiritual wakefulness. There are many kinds of ideas of wakefulness. If you have a teenage son or daughter and they're out on a date, you have wakefulness, because you stay awake all night waiting for them to come home. But we also have a kind of wakefulness which means that we're alert to the kind of temptations and things that are around us, so they don't sort of sneak up on us and take us by surprise. Now, one has to talk about spiritual wakenesses in 2 concepts. One of them is for people living in the world and raising families, and the other is for monastics. That's not to say monastics always have spiritual wakefulness. I've been in monasteries before, and I live in a monastery, so I know very well that spiritual wakefulness is something one has to work at, and it's not something that everybody, even in a monastery, has. In a family, in the world, raising a family, or even not raising a family, but living in the world and working, we also need to have a kind of spiritual alertness. We can't be asleep spiritually. That we anticipate and see, we can even see temptation starting to form, or see some situation outside of ourselves which is beginning to shape up into something that's going to be a temptation for us. And if we're alert and wakeful to it, we can see this developing and react to it even before it becomes a real problem for us, so that these temptations and situations don't sneak up on us and suddenly take us by surprise and then conquer us, just because we're taken by surprise. When we think about how our mind actually, how our brain actually works together with the mind, we realize that God has given us this ability to react instantly in order to save our lives without having thought something through completely. And the same thing is true in our spiritual life if we have spiritual wakefulness, that we can react instantly to a situation that's developing and start to repulse it very quickly. so that it doesn't really enter into our mind fully and start to give us a real serious problem. The spiritual wakefulness is something that comes only through some genuine effort to be spiritually wakeful. And, you know, we can sometimes allow ourselves to get into a situation in which the temptation for something is going to overpower us because we've allowed ourselves to get into that kind of a situation. And if we were spiritual and had spiritual wakefulness, we would never have allowed ourselves to get into such a situation or a condition that the temptation was really going to overpower us. There comes a time when we're in the midst of some kinds of temptation where we suddenly surrender. We give up. We don't resist. We don't even want to resist anymore. And this is what spiritual wakefulness would guard us or keep us against. And let's put it in very common terms and something that is easier to really understand. It's like when you're on a special diet, not just to lose weight, but your doctor's giving you a diet because you have high cholesterol or heart problems. And you are not supposed to eat a lot of things, so you go into an ice cream shop and start looking. And you shouldn't be there in the first place. But when you get there and you start looking at it, you come to suddenly a point where you say, oh, forget it, I'm not going to resist it. I want a banana split. This is a very simple example, but if you think about it, we'll give you the idea. If you were wakeful or alert, you wouldn't have gone into some place where that was for sale in the first place. We still have bakeries, you know, and that sort of thing. But you can think of any number of much more serious circumstances in which you can allow yourselves to get carried away. You start in an argument with, not a family argument, you start in an argument with a coworker, and you get to a certain point where you say, you know, I'm going to flatten his nose. I'm not going to. And this overpowers you because you've allowed it to go so far now that you're beginning to lose control. So you end up actually physically striking someone or something. And even getting your voice louder and louder, and you start swearing and cursing, and really blaspheming Christ and God by swearing and cursing, because you weren't wakeful, you weren't attentive. You allowed yourself to go that far. And this is how spiritual wakefulness has to apply in our lives when we're, of course, working full-time, and some people raising a family, some not. But anyway, we interact with a spouse or with friends or with acquaintances or with fellow workers. And someone will say, you know, you've had a struggle with alcohol, and after work, the guys say, come on, let's go have a beer. And, well, okay, one beer won't hurt. But one beer does hurt. And when you get into the pub, all of a sudden you're tempted to yield, not struggle anymore. But wakefulness in this case would have kept you from going there in the first place. And, you know, unless you could have a soda or coffee or something. But anyway, if you're in a situation where it's delicate and you might yield to a temptation easily, then spiritual wakefulness is going to tell you to avoid the circumstance or situation. And if you see something building up in your presence, to turn and go away from it, or to go and say your prayers or make the sign of the cross or something anyway, to keep you from falling into the temptation. In monasteries, very often, there comes a temptation from boredom, from ennui, as they call it. Ennui is kind of being lethargic and slothful and a little bit becoming lazy, and forgetting why you're in the monastery, forgetting what the struggle is really all about. And a spiritually wakeful person would either go and talk to the abbot right away about it, or take some steps to prevent this from becoming a big temptation to them. And our spiritual wakefulness causes us to examine our minds sometime to actually know what's going on within our own minds. This is a little more possible for people in a monastery, but even there it takes a great deal of effort. We can think about how we respond to our children.